This edition of Tech Talk is brought to you by GlobalSpeak.com, new media consultants, corporate video and audio communications, video and audio production and distribution, live and virtual event production. Tag TV and Tag Radio is a service of GlobalSpeak.com, creatively delivering powerful marketing, video, and audio solutions. Georgina, welcome to Tech Talk.
Thank you so much for having me.
You know, one of the things that we often talk about on Tech Talk is that semantics don't keep up with the technology, the speed of change that's happening. Certainly in the area of disruption is a word that kind of was a novelty when it first came out. Now it's, of course, seemingly they talk about everything as disruption in one kind or another. And the fact of the matter is, I think most of us that are in this environment know full well that it is just that. It isn't happening in just one place and only to one vertical in technology. It's happening to all technologies, all businesses. And I think today's conversation is going to be kind of a really strong wake-up call for some of our listeners who may not be necessarily thinking of, say, for example, in this particular conversation, of retailing and commercial retailing in terms of things like shopping centers, malls, and traditional retail stores. For the setup of the conversation, Georgina, let's say that obviously just in the last few months, and I know just really recently, a number of retailers went for bankruptcy in things like traditional names like J.C. Penney and Radio Shack, and for God's sake, Macy's and Sears. They've all announced these massive closings. Is it a reflection of the economy? Is it a reflection of technology? What's your perspective on it?
Yeah, well, you know, those are the headlines, but I think there's a much bigger story behind those. Consumer spending is on the rise, and I think it's just a time of innovation and change, to be honest. And while there are those headlines, there's a whole load of success stories. As much as that traditional retail experience has been redefined, and many retailers are having some clear successes. You know, margins are being pinched. Competition is high, but you know, as you look at the industry as a whole and the changes which it's going under, there are some clear leaders of the pack who are taking that lion's share of consumer spending.
Well, and let's talk a little bit about that. When you talk about leaders of the pack, are you talking about specifically, things like I guess all of us would assume Amazon as a player within that context. Certainly, I'm not sure the terminology you would use for, is it digital retailing? What is there an industry term specifically for the kind of thing besides e-commerce? I think e-commerce is kind of in this ubiquitous term for the exchange going online. But from a study of the retail industry, do they look at online as just that, online sales and e-commerce, or do they have more or less a digital division that explores innovation and what's next?
Well, yeah, from my side, I think all those terms cover whether it's a retailer going multi-channel or omni-channel. They are selling their goods online, or you've just got pure online players like Amazon, who are now actually looking to bricks and mortar store. So, it's definitely about, retailers looking at the multiple channels which are available to them for them to sell their goods. And, it's worth saying that, over 90% of consumer spend does still happen in bricks and mortar store. So while there's a huge amount to learn off Amazon, and, every retailer should always, be on their toes, looking at what's coming in from the wings and learning from that. It's not by any stretch doom and gloom for the malls or for the high street.
Well, I think you have to use the common sense of investing in the inevitable, and I think that we've seen this disruption kind of impact on so many things. Certainly the premier stories of like Uber and some of the others that have literally disrupted entire legacy systems, processes that have been in play for numbers of decades. I think one of the things, literally hundreds of years, really, from a retailing standpoint. But I guess what I find fascinating, I mean, if you know the retail market and you know something like bricks and mortar, it isn't just bricks and mortar. You're talking about substantial amounts of investment, substantial amounts of assets, and also a long period of time to locate, develop, and build out and develop locations. So in many cases, we can talk about 90%, But I think the other side of it is, from your perspective, wouldn't you say those numbers are going to change reasonably rapidly? And isn't it more or less a case where what we perceive as the retail shopping experience for the millenniums, I think now they're calling them Generation Z or whatever the alphabet letter is anymore, but I think that we clearly understand that demographic is coming towards what would have been traditional things from a completely different perspective. So again, I guess really where my question is that are there any retailers that are getting it right? And you mentioned things like omni-channels and multi-channels. Maybe touch a little bit about the difference between a pure online play like an Amazon and something like I'm assuming like a Macy's that might use a completely different approach.
Yeah, well, you've touched on a number of points in that question. I think, as I said, Amazon is no longer a pure online play because they are obviously seeing there's real value at opening bricks and mortar stores. And whether that's Amazon Go, where you pick your goods off the shelf and, just register that you are there via your Amazon app, or whether that's Amazon Books, where people come in and touch and feel and flick through the books. And there are some extremely successful retailers out there like Primark, which has just opened their flagship stores in the US, who don't sell online. So I don't think we're going to find a golden rule. When you look at the millennials, for example, we think of that group who've always experienced the internet, and having that instant gratification and availability. And so they are going to feel far more familiar with being able to buy things online. But essentially, this is the generation which also believes that experiences are more important than a product. How they've been treated, whether it's VIP access, whether it's affiliating with charitable giving, whether it's an adrenaline experience. I think that's what they place higher than simply, you have Amazon, and the strengths of Amazon it is that instant gratification. They have a huge product range. Their logistics and delivery is fantastic. But essentially, it's a relatively boring experience. You're not going to invite your friends around and shop on Amazon together. Whereas, going out to retail environments is an experience, and especially when you think about the power of social networks and people always wanting to share that experience. If retailers can tap into that and that desire, and I was sitting in a lecture by the Retail Prophet actually only last week. I don't know whether you know Doug Stevenson, and he gave an enthralling lecture, and actually looking at the science of shopping, which releases dopamine, serotonin, very much the same as if you were to snort a line of cocaine. And you don't get that same high and that same addiction just simply clicking a button online. So I think we have to recognize that, and those retailers which are tapping into that experience, how they can create a memorable experience in store, those which are really leading to success, and the people experience as well. I grew up with my dad being CEO of the Booksellers Association in the UK, so all booksellers were, he heard all their woes and their worries when Amazon appeared on the scene. But interestingly, consumer spend in independent bookshops is on the rise, and and they've had one of their best years yet. And you talk about those which have been a real success, and it's those who've recognized we need to have staff who have knowledge, who understand what that customer is really looking for, who can give advice on books, who can, recommend that they sit and have a cup of coffee, and yes, they can flick through the books while they sit. You look at, I met the team from Tommy Bahama last week, and they're loving the new footfall, higher footfall, and also a different type of clientele which they've experienced in their stores where they've bought in a bar and restaurant. people, again, are just enjoying this experience, have a glass of wine, and wander around. And they're getting a far younger clientele experiencing and living the brand. And, you've got Sephora opening 100 more stores this year. And you look at their secret sauce, and it's, despite the fantastic product range, et cetera, it's the makeup tutorials which they offer, the try and test, be taught by an expert. So, I think this is where retail is going, and I think it's in a really exciting time. And it's not about floor, how many dollars you're going to make per square foot anymore. It's more about what kind of different exciting experience can we make part of that purchase journey, and looking from the moment a consumer begins to touch your brand, how can you begin to
develop that relationship?
Really, pinpoint those experiences across the consumer journey.
What's amazing is if you've ever listened to a really successful, very dynamic multiplayer online gaming company, these producers have this magical relationship to the players are not just players. They're part of this incredibly unique, very bonded community that are involved in this one experience, as you're saying, in terms of the game that's being played online. And there's literally television channels, and they broadcast live, and there's community groups and conversations, and on and on and on. The reason I bring that up is that I think that it's a case where branding in the future and the loyalty aspects, I mean, some of the things that from my generation, and of course yours being much younger, and from the experiences that you've had, that we're in a transitional period, that things are not always what they appear to be. And certainly I think when you've got the vested interests that a lot of these commercial developers have, you're going to look for options and alternatives. I mean, wouldn't you say that's kind of what's happening to things like Atlantic Station and now Avalon up in North Fulton? These live, work, play type situations seem to be almost popping up like mushrooms. Is that a real estate play? Is that a commercial retailing play? Is it sort of a hermaphrodite, a combination of both? What's your perspective on that?
Well, I think it's this drive to locality. I think when the tier one supermarkets, which I worked with when I was in the UK, you look at their growth strategy, it's not about the out of town big shopping centres anymore. It's more about opening those small pop-in, on your way home from work in the neighbourhood, in the locality. And I think, people want to be able to wander outside. They want a village feel. And, you look at some of the most successful restaurants in Atlanta, some of them are all owned by the same holding company, but each one has a different identity, a different name. Yeah. And so you feel that you've got something independent, a neighborhood, which you feel a closer loyalty to. And so, I think the headlines which you mentioned earlier, all those big brands, and another part of it is what about all these, independent or seemingly independent, retailers which are popping up all over the place. Like, look at Ponce.
Yeah.
Ponce City Market, which is where our just a few hundred meters from our office. It is absolutely heaving all the time, and as you said, a mixed live, office, restaurant, bars, and shops.
Well, and community.
And that seems
the community
a heady
also.
mix.
Yeah, but I also, I agree with you, and obviously it would be silly not to agree with you. You're the expert, Georgina. But I think it's such a dynamic and fluid environment that some of this stuff is dangerously deceptive in the early stages because it's a transitional communication, not necessarily, a definite decision or a definite direction. I mean, it just seemingly, and I don't want to, get more complicated. Would love to have you back because there's so many aspects of this thing. When you think of 3D printing and when you think of drones, I saw an article the other day about drones now where there was a liquor company that was going to deliver champagne, bottles of champagne by drones to go to events and activities. And I mean, what's going to happen in the future and how it's going to unfold and manifest itself. We often talk about everything being so 20 minutes ago. Things change so rapidly that in this fluid thing with the retailing situation, kind of like grabbing it. How do you get a hold of it and really understand where it's going? Quickly, we've actually run out of time, but I've got to ask one question because I'm going to put you on the spot. But in your estimation, based on your professionalism and frontline experience, what do you think retailers need to be doing? What do they should be doing now?
They need to be listening to their customers, and that means continually asking customers and testing new initiatives and finding out what works. And some of our customers, the way we work, we ask one question on the POS terminal, the payment device, before a customer pays, and that different questions for each customer. But what we're seeing is our customers who are really seeing that difference in the baseline revenue, that average transaction spend per head, are because they've listened to their customers. They've looked at the data which we provide, and they've A/B tested in store. And when you think about the success which many retailers have online, that's because they can say, right, let's change that consumer journey for those IP addresses, and let's see how that affects how long they're going to stay on the site. Let's see how long that's going to affect what they put in their shopping basket. And now with our tool, and I'm sure there are similar, customer feedback solutions out there, but for you to be able to, as a retailer, say, okay, well, let's try out, whether live music in a store actually, let's ask consumers, do they like it? Let's measure how much more they spend per head. And then we have the confidence to implement that strategy across the store. So it's about a test and learn. It's about innovation and continually listening to your customers and changing with those trends. And obviously, I'm CEO and founder of TruRating, but I do believe that we are changing the way retailers work because we are being able to give them a tool where they can listen to, 9 in 10, 88% of customers are answering these questions, and consumers can then say what they like, what they dislike, and retailers can respond in real time. So I think, and I very much believe that we are going to be threaded in that journey as retailers innovate and change in these times, and are very, very excited to be their partner on that journey.
Well, right now, trust is such a concern. When you're talking about so many dynamic technologies and the average owner of a company, executive, entrepreneur, first-generation business person, sometimes they're just, I think they're tsunami. I mean, there's so much going on, so many things that the first choice that I think we always lecture on here or talk about on here is checking out the quality and the character and the integrity of the players, because it's a matter of trust. Because when you're taking somebody down a path that no one's ever been down before, very few, proof of concept is in the capability and the courage of the company you're working with. And I think you guys at TruRating are earning that part of the market. It isn't just the performance of the information and the services that you're providing, but you're doing it with a sense of class and integrity that we've heard a lot about here as far as Tag Radio is concerned, and kind of a kudos to you guys, because that's not an easy thing to do, especially with an early situation as you guys are, Georgina. Hey, listen,
thank you so much.
We're quickly really run out of time, but I do want to ask you back, because I think there's a lot that we could get into in specifics that, while they relate to retailing now, more and less going to relate to a lot of the other verticals as things become more and more pervasive. But hey, thank you so much for taking time out of. I know it's got to be a very happy and exciting time, but thank you for joining us on Tech Talk today.
It's been my absolute pleasure. Thank you.